So recently, YouTuber Nando v Movies, the previous creator of the One Marvelous, Excellent, Villainous, and Musical Scene projects, has returned once more to give us the final of these projects, the very appropriately selected One Last Scene. I saw this and I was all like, free real estate, so I committed myself to analyzing One Last Scene. I considered doing the last scene of Gravity Falls, as it was one of the best finales to any show, but I figured that someone else was going to do it instead, so I should devote my time to something else. My answer came in something that isn't even from a visual medium, Frankenstein. Now I know what you're thinking, but James, Frankenstein got a movie adaptation, and to that I say Igor was made up, Victor wasn't a doctor, the monster was incredibly intelligent, and I bet you can't tell me who Clerval is. So, considering how the movie deviates from the source material, I'm mostly going to be talking about the book. So the first important bit of context you need before I analyze the scene itself is that Frankenstein is not told from the perspective of the titular scientist, but from the POV of Robert Walton. Robert is a man leading an expedition to the North Pole when he sees Victor casually dying of like 10 different diseases, so he picks him up onto the ship. From there, we're told the story through Victor's dialogue. We hear about how Victor made the monster, abandoned the monster, eventually reunited with the monster, at which point the daemon decided to murder Victor's entire family because he had daddy issues. From there, Victor chases the monster all the way up to the North Pole, where he is then picked up by Robert Walton, who is the POV character of the main subject of the video, the last scene of Frankenstein. Actually, the last scene is technically a bunch of scenes that are all recounted to Robert's sister, Margaret, through a series of letters, but we kind of have to talk about all of them right now. Throughout this scene, Victor's health is steadily declining, as he is suffering from like a million diseases, including, but not limited to, hypothermia, heart disease, probably at least 2 types of cancer, and probably also tuberculosis. What would a story set in the Victorian era be without a main character getting tuberculosis? But the diseases are obviously a metaphor for Victor's past crimes against nature coming back to haunt him. As such, it makes sense that after violating the Geneva Conventions, in Geneva no less, he would suffer a natural-ish death, almost as if Mother Nature herself is doing him in. That was a sentence. Karma itself is actually a pretty big theme in this one scene, with many of the characters' past actions finally catching up to them. Another theme is how Victor's story is used as a cautionary tale, an idea which both Victor and the monster seem unilaterally opposed to, but in completely different ways. You see, Robert is only here because he's leading an expedition to the North Pole, but the explorers find themselves in a bit of a pickle when their ship gets stuck in an iceberg. Robert is warned that his crew will probably get Titanicked if they continue the expedition, and they advise him to pull out if they can even get out of the iceberg. Victor, however, doesn't take too kindly to this idea, calling all the crew members cowards for wanting to escape with their lives, abandoning the pursuit of knowledge in the process, showing that Victor regrets nothing, even though he really should regret everything. This further feeds into his persona of being a man of science, which kind of got him into this whole mess. However, Victor seems somewhat happy that Robert wrote down his tale via his letters to Margaret, likely also due to how this could contribute to the field of science. One of the main concessions that any reader of this book must make is that it uses old Victorian words like wretch, but another one is that Victor is kind of really unlikable. I'd argue this enhances the story, though, as it's much more satisfying to watch a selfish jerk die in the cold than to watch a nobleman die in the cold, even if the jerk refuses to admit to his mistakes. For most of the book, the monster acts as a foil to Victor, which is also exemplified by this final scene. After Victor dies, because of course he does, the monster shows up. He expresses how one day every record of his and Victor's stories will be erased, and how that might not be such a bad thing. Clearly, unlike Victor, he actually realized we should do everything in our power to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again. 1, because he actually learns from his follies, and 2, because he seems opposed to the idea of doing things just for the sake of science. So, I guess, editing James here, I'm just gonna clarify what I meant by the monster didn't want to use Victor's tale as a cautionary tale, because, humans are very bad at repeating their mistakes, when they hear about stuff, and they're like, oh, well, maybe I can do that better this time. So that's kind of what I meant by that, because he just doesn't want a record of that to be in existence, because then that would mean that people might try to replicate it and cause another disaster like that one. This is where the main difference between him and Victor shows. The unknown is terrifying, but while Victor wants to conquer it, the monster, being the rational giant scary man he is, wants to merely stay within the boundaries of the laws of nature. I feel like those are pretty good boundaries, but maybe that's just me. The monster himself is a living representation of what happens when you do a little tiny crime against nature, and this is arguably the most tortured part of his existence. And it was truly a tortured existence, that of Frankenstein's monster. During this final scene, he expresses his regrets over having, quote, murdered the lovely and the helpless, strangled the innocent as they slept, and grasped to death his throat who never injured me. In layman's terms, the monster was a very bad boy, and he wants to take full responsibility for his actions. Another difference between him and Victor. And yeah, this also ties into the theme of karma that I mentioned earlier. Victor only wants to run away from his mistakes, but the monster of all people was willing to sit down and admit to his blunders. And so, staring down into the freezing water below him, the monster jumped to meet his fate and presumably freeze to death. After all the suffering that the monster inflicted on Victor and his family, one would think that this was a deserved fate. But after all the suffering the monster had to endure, I struggle to not feel pity for him. He, much like Victor, is a very morally gray character, but he has many more sympathetic traits than his creator. Ironic. But that's the final scene of Frankenstein. Truly exquisite in the best way possible. Frankenstein is one of those books that I keep thinking about even a year after I'm done with it, simply because of how thought-provoking this classic is. Shame the movie had to go and ruin it, but that's a story for another day.